Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining another episode of the PM Learning Series. My name is Shivi. I am the guest of the show today. Please introduce yourself, drop in the comments where you're watching us from. So, the PM Learning Series is a series of live streaming events where industry thought leaders and product practitioners share their PM career journeys and lessons learned along the way to inspire current and aspiring PMs to level up their product career. Make sure you subscribe to our newsletter in the event description below to receive a recap of today's event as well as future event updates. So today with me, we have a very, very special guest. Very honored to have Deb joining us today. Thank you for joining us, Deb.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here.
Wow, I'm really excited also to see Jerry, who's a fellow LinkedIn influencer, joining this session. So Deb, you have definitely has the draw. So yes, guys, please drop in the chat where you're joining us from. But before we start, I just like to give an introduction to Deb. As many of you know, Deb is a very seasoned technology executive based in Silicon Valley. She's currently the president and CEO of Ancestry, a company that sits at the forefront of family history and consumer genomics. Prior to this, Deb served as on the leadership team as vice president of Facebook App Commerce. She founded one of my favorite Facebook products of all time, Facebook Marketplace, and created Facebook Pay, Facebook Audience Network, and ads. Prior to that, Deb spent several years at PayPal, where she led the eBay Marketplace product team and created charitable donation and social commerce teams. And Deb is also the author of the book, Take Back Your Power, which is the main topic of today. And that book has definitely inspired a lot of us. So thank you for sharing your wisdom, your story, your research, Deb, and for being on the stage with us today.
It's my honor.
Thank you. So today is a very, very special session for a couple of reasons. First, we have a very special and honored guest, Deb, with us. And then second, this is actually the last session of the year for the PM Learning Series. So we'll end it very strong with that. This is the 23rd episode of this year. We have over 50,000 people watching us from all over the world over this past year. So it's very exciting. And then for those of you, bonus, if you stay till the very end of this live session, we'll be sharing a private Zoom link to invite you to an after party to have a more intimate, close conversation with Deb. So stay tuned. And yeah, drop in the chat where you're joining us from. I see some folks from New York, Aditha from London. Daniel says, cheers to powerful women. Aaron from California, Irvine, Philly, Nathan, lots of allies joining today's session as well. So yeah, please continue to say hi. And if you have any question for Deb, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll pick them out from time to time, for our discussion. So Deb, let's talk about, your book is about Take Back Your Power. I want to talk a little bit about power because, you came across this invite because I hosted a virtual book club with 50 other women that we wanted to talk about our experience with power at the workplace. And one thing that, that's noted earlier in your book and something that we discussed quite a bit in our club is that women don't usually acknowledge that we have power, right? And as a result, we kind of giving others a free pass. What would you say were some of your triggering moments that you realized you have given, someone this free pass and you really need to take back your power?
Well, I think part of it is that first, we have really discomfort with women in power. When you say a powerful woman or a woman seeks power, it just feels a little bit off, and I love that, Fortune has this most powerful women list that they are actually owning that. And I think women now have come into to understand that the word power is actually not a dirty word. If you actually look at what it means in the dictionary, it means the ability to influence events and people around you. And don't we all want that? And yet, when we talk about women in power, it feels wrong for some reason. And studies have shown that when you talk about women in power, it actually makes people feel negative feelings relative to men in power when we talk about it. And so, part of it is that there have been many times when The joke on my team is that no one has ever handed me the check at a meal because they've never assumed that I'm the most senior person at the table. And it's true for like the last 10 years, basically. It's true that, I go to a lot of places, I talk to a lot of people, and if they don't know who I am, they talk to the man who's standing next to me first. In fact, I went to this conference called Money 2020 for many years, and we would start with three people, my partnerships lead and myself, and then there would be a third party, and eventually it would go from a triangle to literally the two people talking by themselves and me standing off to the side. This happens all the time where women are underestimated. And look, I get it. If you're playing the odds, I'm likely not to be the leader. I'm not going to be the CEO of the company. I'm not going to be the person on board because playing the odds, it's more likely to be someone else who doesn't look like me. And yet, when we don't say anything, when we don't call it out, what are we doing to the next woman who's in the circumstance? What are we doing that allowing this assumption to stand? And so, it's not about being rude. It's really about just saying, hey, there was a CEO who was trying to sell his company to us, and he spent 20 minutes talking to my colleague. And at some point, he's a great ally. He goes, she decides whether we buy your company or not. And that poor CEO was so horrified, but I think he will never make that assumption again, honestly. And I think that was a moment where just by calling out, he's going to be a better ally too.
Definitely. I think it's important to educate in those moments, when people are just unconsciously thinking that, hey, woman is not the one who's writing the check. I think that's powerful. I just want to say hi to a couple more folks joining us internationally. Ariel from Tel Aviv, Hilary from Toronto, and then Oma Laura from Nigeria. I believe Laura has joined many of our sessions, and then it's pretty late in Nigeria, so thanks for joining us. So Deb, you mentioned that a lot of us are not very comfortable with holding power, right? Or look up dictionary, it feels like it's just not natural. I remember during one of the discussions, Prashanti, who's part of the club, asked me, have recommended a book for me to read, which was Jeffrey Pfeffer's book, Power. And then I remember I put in an audio book, and it was really uncomfortable to read it about different sources, how you can be strategic about it, tapping into different, circles of power. So I wonder, what are some typical tips that you have for women, not just taking back that power, but actually intentionally being more comfortable about it so we can grow it, harnessing it, and eventually maybe sharing that power to elevate others and do more goods?
Well, first, I love Jeffrey Pfeffer's book. That's actually what set me on the path to write this book. I have been speaking in his class for the last 8 years. I will be back in February. And part of that was his book is it's an uncomfortable take on power, which is how to play politics, how to understand. And he doesn't say you should do it. He says this is how the world works. You just need to understand it and you get to choose what to do. But I go to his class, and every time I ask, and I'm one of the very few women who actually does this panel, the women ask, well, can we do these things? And I'm like, not in the same way. And I said, someday I'm going to write a book that's a guide for women to power. And I think I said that maybe 4 years ago, and I finally got it out. So now I can actually hand out copies of the book at the class. But I think, I think we have to understand that people experience women differently than they experience men. They experience people very differently based on identity, stereotypes, the way they grew up. And again, this is not good or bad. It's not discrimination necessarily. It's just unconscious bias. And so I think part of it is really kind of saying, hey, this is what power means to me, and this is how I want to exercise it in a positive way, and being open about who you are and what you want to do.
I like how you personalize, reframe that fear into something that's meaningful to you. Something that worked well for me along those lines was like, may the force be with you. Like power could be a force for good. I do have one question that I want to double click because we do have women, for example, Laura joining us from Nigeria, where she grew up or maybe work in an environment that's a little bit more like less privileged, right? Where the cultural expectation is for, women not to speak up. I think even in Asian culture, when I grew up, I think the good girls are always conditioned to be quiet, to, not stick your head, out. So what advice would you give for women to work or grew up in such environment to, maybe can play a role that's bigger, maybe speaking up? What advice would you give them to fight that society expectation?
Well, I love that question because, I remember my mom said, I pray that you and your sister will grow up to be the word is demure or wunro, which is like graceful. And I said, you are absolutely not graceful at all. You literally left everything you knew, went to another country and started a new life. You're one of the fiercest people I know. My grandmother, who never had a formal education, ran my grandfather's company after he passed. You know, I said, what do you mean you want us to be graceful and demure? And it was so interesting because the dichotomy of what we hope for our children and yet what, but I said, I learned from the very best, the most powerful women. And so I think that there's this cultural dichotomy too. It's like, what does it mean? Somebody said that Eileen Lee said to me, what do we mean when we say a good guy? Right? He's a good guy. It's like, I vouch for him. He has my endorsement. He's great. What do we mean when we say a good girl? It means someone obedient, someone who's submissive, somebody who is demure. And so we don't have a language for like, I vouch for her. She's amazing. But we have that for men. And for women, the counterpart is actually something that's subservient or sweet or obedient. And so we just don't, we use language in a way that encodes what our biases are. And I think part of that is then to say, okay, well, what does it look like to succeed in an environment where leadership in America looks very different than what I grew up with, right? My parents are like, I have this article called Lessons with My Parents. Like, you like put your head down and get the work done, right? People recognize that and promote you and give you opportunities. That is actually not how the world works. I learned it all wrong. And I think that we do learn those lessons, right? It's like, get an A on the test. That's what success looks like. And then we get out into the workforce for everybody and we think, wait, what dimensionally is valuable is totally different. And I went to my Stanford reunion, and we all joked at the Stanford reunion. We were all so stressed out about stats class, econ, corporate finance, but the thing that makes a difference in your life actually were touchy feely. It was organizational behavior. It was all the soft skills that make a difference between success and failure. And so I think we need to understand that you have to have the hard skills, but it's the soft skills that make you better or more successful in life. And so it's really figuring out how you exercise those soft skills in the environment in which you're in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your point really resonated with LinkedIn user as well. I think it's gaining that awareness, right? Whether it comes from cultural, where how you grew up, gaining that awareness, having a language to describe that unconscious bias. That's how you can then basically caught yourself or caught others when such situation happens, and then reframe the narrative that others are telling or you have it for yourself. So thank you for sharing that. Um, I remember one of your very famous interview was the one that you mentioned about the 5 words from Sheryl Sandberg that you said have changed your life. Um, you said she told you you can stop now because you have won. I just like to maybe if you can tell that story a little bit to the audience, and what advice would you give, for people who feel like maybe they haven't won, and like, how do they fight to get to
Yeah.
where you are? I guess, yeah.
Yeah, so the word she said was, you can stop fighting now. You've won. And I'll give you the context in which it's read, but it can actually be read a different way as well. The context in which it was read was, I just had this chip on my shoulder. I grew up in a small town in the deep South in South Carolina where no one looked like me, where people told us to go back to where you came from. And I was from New York, and I would say, New York? They're like, no, where you really came from. And I was thinking, where did I really come from? And, to be alienated and to be other, this whole feeling that I was always going to be a foreigner in my own home. It's always just like something which caused me to have this kind of fight in me. And so it was a huge rocket fuel. I'm going to graduate. I'm going to be valedictorian. I'm going to get a scholarship to college. I'm going to do all these things and prove to them that like I'm worthy and that I know better and that, I never have to return to this place. And it works until it doesn't work, because that also can really appear to other people to be a chip on your shoulder. And that's what happened to me, which was I had so much fight in me that everything was a fight. And I had to actually take a step. When she called me out on it, I was like, whoa, you're right. I wish I could say it kind of changed overnight, but that's actually, it was a process. It was a process where I realized that I wasn't alone, that I didn't have to fight every decision. I didn't have to like mark my place to make a place in this world. And, when she said you can stop fighting now, it wasn't that you shouldn't fight for women who haven't had opportunities. You shouldn't fight for, opportunities for those who haven't had been given that chance. It was that you can stop fighting every little thing because you have this chip on your shoulder and you can actually understand and process this now. And it took me a long time, and I've reached the other side of that. But I do think we still should fight for all the things that we believe in, like I started Women in Product to bring more women into technology so that they can be founders, VCs, so that, the products we use are much more women friendly. I fight by, investing in DEI, by, being a part of a lot of communities to really continue to bring different voices to the table. So we build better products and we're better companies and we build a better world. And so those things are still worth fighting for. But what she was talking about is sometimes there's a thing that causes you to react to things a different way. And it was like intent, behavior, or perception. Your intent is what you feel, your behavior is what you exhibit, and perception is what other people see in you. And my intent was, I want to achieve all these things, and my behavior was actually very combative, and the perception was that I was fighting all the time, and I needed to change that.
I love that framework of intent, behavior, perception, because your intent could be very well differently perceived by someone or by your behavior. So that's a good, I think, mental model to think about. Um, I think there's some chats from folks. Pam is really resonating with some of the points that you made earlier around, having the language to describe when you're in a less privileged environment and how you fight that stereotype. And then I think Nathan, being an ally and being someone from Kentucky and part of the LGBT community, having to fight, to have a seat at the table, right, to have their voice heard. Um, um, so some LinkedIn user also sharing his or her experience around facing that pressure and how to fight back through reframing and empowering women to succeed in hearing others' voice. So thank you for sharing your perspective, folks. If you have questions for Deb, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll pick them out from time to time. So that we have a number of folks who are joining us, I think, are not just women, they are males as well. I'd like to just take this opportunity because before we transition into talking more about power becoming CEO, how do you think allies can better support women and each other in this environment?
Well, one thing is no one succeeds alone. And if you read these stories about these like solo heroes who succeeded alone, and all they did was write everyone else out of the story. And so, I part of my book is a tribute to all the people who have actually made my career possible, and a lot of these allies and sponsors, mentors, who have really transformed my career. I wrote a whole chapter on allies. It's about mentors and sponsors, so people who give you advice, but also people who open doors, who actually give you opportunities. And then I talk about your team. These people you labor with every single day, and then it's your circle. These are the people you live life with. These are your peers who, inside or outside of work, you go to and you need a shoulder to cry on and needs people to celebrate with. And each of these allies are incredibly powerful parts of your life. And, I think that the things that accelerate your career the most, though, is having a career sponsor. And I talk a lot about that because it is the few career sponsors I had. And I've had so many who've been so generous and then made it possible. Amy Clement was the VP of product at PayPal early on. She hired like the first dozen PMs there. And she really transformed my career. I had only managed for a couple of years. I'd only been a PM a couple of years, and she gave me the opportunity to lead the entire eBay team at PayPal, which was their biggest business at the time. That is insane. That was a crazy decision on her part, but it accelerated my career maybe 5, 10 years because I never would have had that opportunity but for her. So many of these different people have said, they actually hold your hand and say, I think you can do this. And, I would not be here today but for people like Amy, like Doug, like Mike, and I write about all of these people because they were the people who believed in me when I wasn't even sure it was possible. And so I encourage each of you, if you don't have one, to find a career sponsor. It is transformative. And when you have one, you feel it. You feel this person is actually wind at your back. They open up doors that you never could have imagined for yourself. And I say that, I'm on the board of Intuit because Sheryl Sandberg said, I want you to meet Brad Smith. I was a random director at the company, not very senior. And she said, I want you to meet Brad Smith because someday he might have a board seat open. I'm like, that's insane. I'm nobody. Why would you say that? And several years later, actually, I met him again and she said, he has a board seat open and he'd like to meet you again. Years before, maybe 3 years before, at this point, I was qualified to be on a board. I was actually a GM of my area, had built a lot more. But for 3 years, before I was even qualified to be on a board, she thought, hey, I think you should consider something. And I thought, that is an incredible kind of sponsorship that very few people have. And so I work every day to pay that forward. And that's really, really important to me.
Yeah, I love that example. I remember reading it. I do want to double click on part of that, but we have one question as well from Milena. How do you speak about the greatness of having all the sponsors helping you, giving you stretch opportunities? How do you win their support from the at the beginning when you're just nurturing and building their relationship?
First of all, I wish I had some roadmap because I get this question a lot. I actually think turning your manager into your sponsor or turning your mentor into your sponsor is the easiest and fastest way. I've managed a lot of people, but not sponsored all of them. I've mentored a lot of people and not sponsored all of them either. But it's the people who are eager to learn, the people who actually say, hey, instead of saying, Milena, do you have some advice for me? Say, I would ask her instead, Milena, as my mentor, are there two things you think I need to do to open more doors? What would that advice be? And then follow up and say, here's what I did. Can you suggest for example, let's say you say, hey, I think you should go and do more speaking. Instead of saying, oh, that's great advice, I'll go find out. Can you introduce me to two places or two people that can help me do that? Suddenly you're actually turning them from a passive advisor to an active participant in your success. And a lot of people actually just aren't asked these questions. I was just talking last night to a woman who had come up to me, and I've invested in a bunch of small startups. I advise some startups, and she was the only founder, by the way, who's ever pinged me and said, by the way, you actually must get a lot of speaking engagements. If you can't make one, could you actually ask them to ask me instead? And I was just so impressed that she actually asked me that. And I have sent her some, and we've become close. And another woman reached out to me, and I had known her for a long time, and she said, hey, I'm interested in getting on a board. Can you work with me on how to do that? And last night I introduced her to a board recruiter. And so the point is, again, it was people who actually took the first step. It didn't occur to me that these two women these were things I could have done for them. They were social friends. We had worked together. We just didn't. But by them asking, suddenly they gave me the opportunity to be their sponsor. And the worst that could happen is I said no. But they took that risk. And the thing is, if you're not hearing no enough, you probably aren't asking enough too. Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Sorry about that. That does happen. But I love the advice. It's just when you ask, something could happen. The worst is that nothing will happen, but you create that opportunity and that possibility. I love one of the question from the audience, Kate, who's also part of the book club. She's asking you about your thoughts around, let's say you're the youngest person and you're a woman in the room. What advice would you give for folks to harness their power?
Well, how many of you think Shivy is powerful? Right? I mean, some of the most powerful PMs aren't the ones who have the most experience, but they have something to say. They have questions they're going to ask. And I think that you can be powerful. Age, obviously, and tenure, and yes, those things help, a title. But some of the most influential and powerful PMs I know are not the most senior. I remember there was a PM who reached out to me and he said, I want to be the first PM on Marketplace. And I'm like, I don't even have a PM role. And he's like, well, I'm not even a PM, I'm an RPM. But he's like, you're going to create a job for me. And I thought, that's crazy. And Bowen became our first PM on Marketplace. And so the point is, this is before I could even get people at the company to fund building Marketplace. The point is, if you have something, you have way more power. Like the fact is, he was the only one who ever asked. And he became our first PM. And he's gone on to do amazing things. And the point is that you don't have to be the most powerful. You don't have to be the loudest voice. You just have to know what you want and you have to go after it.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. I think people really resonate about the point around asking. It doesn't hurt to ask. And if you're not hearing no enough, you're probably not asking enough. I think that's a good mentality. And then Annabella also shared about her advice of how sponsors lift her up at work. Now, Deb, I want to ask you, you mentioned about the Intuit board opportunity, but I also want to just spin it and say, you're a CEO of a multi-billion dollar company. Have you ever have you always thought about becoming a CEO? I know in your book you talk about imposter syndrome as well, but at what point, do you have the courage to pursue like a big, bold aspiration, such as becoming a CEO? And what advice would you give for maybe women's in their 20s, 30s to maybe intentionally cultivate certain skills or relationships to take on, powerful ambitions, such as becoming a CEO?
Well, I just remember I went to Fiji Simo's conference room after, I don't remember, there was some reorg or something happened at work, and I was upset. And I was complaining to her, and she's like, you know what? We're going to be CEO someday. She said, it just seemed so out of the blue to me. And I said, that is absolutely crazy. What makes you think that we're going to be CEO someday? She is now the CEO of Instacart, by the way. And this was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And the point is, she had a very clear vision of where she was going to go, and this was where it was going to take her. And I laughed when she said that, and I said, that is crazy. And she's like, you will make it someday. I know it. And it's funny, right? Because we ended up in the same place in a lot of ways, but she had a clarity of thought, knowing where she wanted to get to life. And I just thought that is the most insane thing I ever heard. And then when this opportunity came up, I actually reached out to her and she's like, you got to do this. So the point is, you don't absolutely have to know, but you can also end up in the same place. I wish I had planned a little better, but I did not. But I also talk about in the book when I was reached out about a public company CEO position. And when they reached out to me, I said, well, why me? And the board recruiter, Jim Citron, said, well, why not you? Every CEO has to get their first job sometime. And even though that one didn't work out, and I just ended up really changing my mentality on the opportunity. And I think sometimes we just, there was a woman who texted me. I met her on LinkedIn. She reached out to me, and we ended up talking. And a recruiter said, hey, are you interested in the CEO position? And she's like, what should I say? I'm like, yes. You should say yes. You're going to interview for it. And I said, even if you don't get it, it's an opportunity for you to understand the possibility. And, that's what I hope all of us will do, which is, it's a learning experience, right? And opening your mind to the possibility makes it possible for you. I think for so long I was very close to the possibility this was even an opportunity.
Absolutely. Being just open to opportunity, I think open doors to many. Just like asking for help from sponsors, I think is similar along that line of being open and be bold to ask requests for help. I know Sumaya asked a really good question. They're near and dear to many of women's heart, but we're going to address that more deeply during our after party session in the Zoom chat, so that maybe we can do a little role play with Dab and see how Dab would address such a situation. But before we conclude today's session, I know 30 minutes is really short. I do want to ask you a couple more questions that we curated earlier from our book club. Some of us are parents, moms in particular, are really worried about how to show up in over the past few years, especially we see a lot of escalation of social challenges, right, from racial discrimination, abortions, women's rights, Black Lives Matters. So beyond, I guess, direct power, how should women show up as leaders at work, but also as parents, setting examples for our children? I know you
Well,
have
first,
3 girls.
yeah.
How do you do
I have
it
a
at
son.
home?
I have a son and two daughters, and
Right.
I have 3 kids. And I would say this, which is maternal bias, by the way, is one of the greatest biases that you can have in the workplace. Like basically, you're 70% less likely to get hired, and if you're hired, it was something like you make $10,000 less, right? Because they think you're not serious about your job, or that you're. And I wrote recently about what they don't tell you, the secret about maternity leave, and how during my 6 years of being pregnant and having my 3 kids, my career kind of went backwards. So it was not great. And it's not. I think that all those things in the back of our heads, but at the same time, it doesn't mean you should not ask for what you want. You should not go after the promotion you want. You should not look for the job that you want. I think it means you have to understand that you need to get support. I remember I was really burnt out at one point as a mother. My daughter, my youngest, actually, she had colic. She cried 3 hours a night, and I was just going insane. My dad was in hospice. He was very, very sick with stage 4 cancer, and I had 2 toddlers who were just like, make her stop crying. And it was just very stressful. We were also renovating our house. So we were living in like a 2 bedroom apartment with like my mom. It was just at some point it was just so stressful. And I just remember thinking, why are we doing all this? And I said to my manager, and he was my 7th manager in 2.5 years at Facebook. And I just said to him, I just don't know if I could do this. And he said, well, look at our male colleagues. And he actually pointed out each male colleague. He's like, this person's wife stays at home. This person stays at home. My own wife stays at home. What makes you think you have to do all this alone? And I think we just, I don't know if you guys read the Broad Street. I think it was this week. There was an article about, the secret female executives don't talk about, which is all the help they get. Because you need to get help and it's okay. And yet women are judged really negatively. Like I wrote on LinkedIn about some of the help I've had, and there's so many comments like, well, don't you feel like you missed out on your children's childhood? And I read some of the comments to my husband, and he said, no one has ever said that to me. Because, not only did you have that help, I had that help too. But the point is, we do judge mothers very differently in our society. Like they are the ones who should to take care of everything and juggle the world. And I just, I share with him some of the comments I get, and he's like, why would anyone say that? And I just realized we just live in different universes, even though we share a family and we share the household responsibilities. And he's a very successful tech executive in his own right. So the point is, I think we need to actually learn to be more gentle with each other and actually more gentle with ourselves, and to say, we don't have to be everything to everyone all the time, and that sometimes there are different seasons in our life where we need to do certain things to make things work.
I like the being gentle and overcoming mom guilt, right? Others can
Yes.
say stuff, but just keeping that perspective, I think it's really helpful. Um, yes, we're coming up on time, so I'm going to share a special link for folks to join us in an after party for those who have stayed so far with us. But Deb, I want to conclude this session by asking you one question. Looking back, like what would you wish your younger self known? Like what are something that you wish you have done differently? What's a parting advice you want to give to folks?
I wish that the one number one thing is I wish I I had been more forgiving of myself. I wish that I had, you know, I just realized that now I when I was even 20 and in my 30s, like I had so much more power than I ever imagined. And I always felt like I was striving for the next thing or I needed to accomplish one more thing. But actually you have so much more power every single day. You have so much more voice, you have so much more opportunity than you ever imagined. But giving yourself permission, not giving yourself a free pass, all of those things are really important at any point in your career you're at, no matter where you are.
That's a great advice. Being kind to ourselves. Women are known to be very harsh. I know I'm really harsh on myself, and I learned that. But thank you so much, folks, for joining us and staying with us till the end. If you want to have a more interactive conversation with Deb directly by asking her question, here's the after party Zoom link. Feel free to click on it. If they ask for your password, it will be power all capitalized. And I hope to see you in the after party. And thank you, Deb, for
Thank
joining
you.
us.